Okay, now we're going to look at ecosystems where we take the community, but we factor in the non-living components of the community and how those things affect the living components and how the living components affect those non-living components, how they essentially interact. Of course, ecosystems can be studied at a relatively small scale or a much larger scale if one likes to. And we are concerned with the movement of energy and materials through those cycles. Chemical cycling, we'll look at some of the different chemical cycles that are typically studied. We want to keep in mind, this is very important, that energy flows through systems while matter is recycled. That is, energy has a one-way trip through an ecosystem, whereas the matter is constantly being reused, constantly being recycled. And so what living systems do is they transform the energy and process the matter. Okay. And of course, these systems are subject to the laws of physics and chemistry. And when we look at energy flowing through a system, because of the second law of thermodynamics, the transferring of energy from one part of the system to the next is not 100% efficient, and so a lot of it gets converted into heat. It gets converted into a less compact, less energy-rich form. Essentially, entropy increases. Okay, so basically it enters the system as sunlight and ultimately leaves as heat. It's the producers, the autotrophs, that absorb that energy in the form of sunlight, pass it on to herbivores, who then pass it on to carnivores, and again, as it moves through the system, a lot of it is lost as heat, and eventually all of it is lost as heat. So again, the energy has a one-way trip, lost as heat. The matter is passed along, but is constantly being recycled. Essentially through the process of decomposition, it gets sort of back into the soil and then back into the plants. Yeah, of course, again, these decomposers, sometimes known as detritivores, living off of dead stuff, take that dead stuff and are able to recycle it into their bodies and then back into the soil or into the air in the case of, as we'll see, nitrogen. Okay, we talked a little bit in the last chapter about primary production, net primary production and gross primary production. So the primary production is what the plants do, converting that sunlight energy into chemical energy. Now, the degree to which this happens in a given area, a given habitat, depends on the amount of sunlight there is. And when you look at the globe, of course, the globe is a ball in space, and so the part of the globe that's getting the most direct sunlight and the most intense sunlight per unit area is at the equator. And so you tend to find the highest productivity at the equator because, again, they're getting the most sunlight per unit area. Whereas you go away from the equator up to more northern and southern latitudes, you're getting less sunlight per unit area, and you tend to have less primary productivity. And of course, of the sunlight that hits the planet, not all of it is striking plants or algae. A lot of it's just striking bare ground or water that's relatively lacking in algae. Okay, so the gross primary production, again, is the amount of sunlight energy that is taken in by a plant. The net is the amount of that energy that is converted into new plant matter. Okay, that NPP is what is available to the next level, the consumers. The amount of net primary productivity varies a great deal. This just shows the percent of the Earth that is covered by different types of habitats. You can see it's mostly open ocean. So the amount of primary productivity, net primary productivity, there's a large amount that occurs in the ocean just because there's so much of the Earth is covered by ocean. But you can see per unit area, the oceans are not terribly productive. Where are the most productive areas? Algal beds and reefs, tropical rainforest, estuaries, swamps and marshes, tropical seasonal forests. So you see the tropics in particular, all that sunlight, in particular the wet tropics, are going to be really productive. And so you can see, even though tropical rainforests make up a relatively small portion of the Earth's surface, they make up a big chunk of the Earth's net primary productivity. Again, warm and wet year-round, lots of sunlight. Whereas, of course, things like deserts, where there's a desert, they would have relatively, okay, tundra is way up north, but they're frozen most of the year, so they don't produce much, really. And then there we go, deserts. You can see deserts make up actually a little bit more of the Earth than tropical rainforests, but their productivity is so low that they make up hardly any of the total. Okay. Most NPP occurring on land, you can see, about a third in the ocean. Again, the ocean's not terribly productive, except in some coastal areas in particular. Why would those coastal areas be more productive, do you think? Runoff from the land, basically. Those nutrients flowing off the land, making those coastal areas relatively productive. So, marine systems, freshwater, any aquatic system, what's going to limit productivity is light and nutrients. Of course, the surface will tend to be more productive than when you get deeper down because, of course, there's less sunlight. And nutrients are not equally distributed around the globe in the oceans, and so that impacts productivity. As I just said a moment ago, those coastal areas will tend to get these nutrients running off of the land, which makes those coastal areas more productive. And here's an example in Long Island. Off of Long Island, you can see there's some variation in the amount of phytoplankton and the amount of productivity because some areas are getting more nutrient inputs than others. Out here, there's not a whole lot of nutrient inputs, so their productivity is relatively low. Whereas up in this part, there's much greater nutrient inputs and therefore greater productivity. Lakes, of course, are impacted as well, and this process where nutrients are added to water and the productivity increases a great deal is what's called eutrophication, and that carried to an extreme can be a bad thing. Here's an experiment where they took this lake that had this constriction and they blocked it off, and they did an experimental addition of nutrients to this one side, and the algal population went through the roof. That can have a negative impact on the fish. And in particular, when all those algae begin to die, it can suck a lot of the oxygen out of the water. Some may sound somewhat counterintuitive, but as they die, they decompose and pull a lot of oxygen out of the water and make the conditions relatively anoxic and tough for the fish. Okay, so primary productivity, again, impacted by the amount of sunlight and essentially impacted by the climate, and the climate is determined by two things: temperature and moisture. You can have tropical climates where they're warm year-round, temperate climates like where we live, where they have warm summers and cool winters, and you can have Arctic climates where it's cold most of the year. Within any of those, the moisture can vary. You can have wet tropics and dry tropics. You can have wet temperate areas and dry temperate areas and everything in between. And when you factor those two things together, that has a big impact on primary productivity. One way you can look at that is the amount of water that's being transpired from plants, and not surprising, where you get more evaporation, evapotranspiration, you have more productivity. Again, those tropical areas, deserts, Arctic areas, not much going on in the way of primary productivity. And a more local scale, of course, nutrients can play a role. So you might be in a very wet, warm area, but if it's relatively lacking in nutrients in the soil, it's not going to be terribly productive. Okay, we talked about this the other day and how when you have food chains, with ecosystem ecology, we're concerned with, as we said, energy moving through them. And then because of the second law of thermodynamics, the amount of energy that flows from one step to the next is relatively limited. I gave you a figure of about 10%. Our book says less than 20. Again, it's going to vary depending on the system. Now, this is essentially what we're doing in our experiment we set up the other day. We're going to look at how efficient our caterpillars are at taking energy, nutrients, etc., from the foods they're eating. Because, of course, when an animal eats something, there's a certain amount of energy in that food, but a lot of the energy in that food just goes straight through them. A good chunk is lost as heat through cellular respiration, and a relatively small proportion becomes part of them, is incorporated into them as new biomass. Again, ranging from 5 to 20. We can think of these in terms of pyramids, again, where there's a certain amount of energy that comes into the system. The plants are able to convert a certain amount of that into new plant biomass. Herbivores are able to take a certain amount of the plant biomass, convert it into theirs, etc., etc. So as you move up the food chain, there's basically less of the original amount of energy left. So it's not only energy, but as that decreases as you move up the food chain, but also the amount of biomass. There's, of course, a lot of plant biomass, less herbivore biomass, less primary carnivore or less secondary carnivore, etc., as you move up the food chain. And the same with numbers. Lots of plants, fewer herbivores, fewer primary carnivores, fewer secondary carnivores, etc. The numbers decrease as you move up the food chain. Now, a little bit of an environmental issues discussion here. So you may have heard the term eating lower on the food chain, and what that means is eating less meat or no meat and eating more plant material. That is, you're basically skipping a step in the food chain. Now, how is that more efficient? Well, by skipping a step, you're getting rid of that wasteful link in the food chain. So essentially, if you eat a lot of meat, those herbivores had to eat a lot to produce that meat. And if you had skipped that step, it would take less plant material to feed you than under this scenario where it takes a lot of plant material to feed the cow to feed you. So under this scenario, the total amount of plant material needed is greater than on the system in the left. And so there's concern about this. Particularly as countries like China become wealthier, they tend to want to eat more meat, again, making the systems more inefficient. And so there is concern about the ability to feed everyone on the planet if people eat a diet that's relatively rich in meat. Why is the world so green? Well, indeed it is, at least in some places, not all places, but many places it's quite green. It's, of course, quite green around us this time of year in particular. There's so much water. Why don't the animals just eat everything? Well, of course, plants have defenses, those secondary compounds that can reduce herbivory. There's, of course, competition between animals for those plants, competition between animals that, of course, limit the number of animals. Abiotic factors, climate can impact the animals and keep their numbers in check. And also certain essential nutrients, even though there may be a lot of plants out there available for the herbivores, other things, nutrients, again, abiotic factors, competition can all keep those animal populations in check. It's not just their food supply. It's not just that bottom-up control, but top-down controls as well. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and we'll continue with the next video.